16 October 1944. 2nd Air Fleet Headquarters, Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome stood outside and watched the air battle he was commanding burn itself out above him. For 4 days, his aircrews had been flying against the American carrier force off the coast. And for 4 days, they had come back with the same report: American carriers ablaze, American battleships going down, the Third Fleet destroyed at sea. The claims were tallied and forwarded to Tokyo. 11 aircraft carriers sunk, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers. Tokyo believed them. Radio Tokyo announced the greatest naval victory of the war. There were public celebrations in the streets. An imperial rescript was issued. The emperor's forces had broken the American fleet. Fukudome, watching the sky over Formosa, had already begun to doubt it. He saw aircraft falling in flames and understood, with a professional's eye, that most of the burning machines were his own, flown by boys with a few dozen hours of training against pilots with hundreds. Not one American ship had been sunk, not one. 2 cruisers were damaged, one of them badly, and both of them were under tow. Within days, those sunken carriers were operating off the Philippines, and the Third Fleet's commander sent a signal that would be repeated for 80 years. All ships recently reported sunk by Radio Tokyo had been salvaged and were retiring at high speed toward the enemy. Japanese officers had a name for the problem by then, and it was not a joke. They were fighting a fleet that would not stay sunk, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the carriers themselves. It had to do with a collection of slow, unglamorous, almost unarmed ships that no Japanese pilot ever bothered to attack. Section 1. The same battle, the same day, 8 May 1942. The Coral Sea. 2 fleet carriers were badly hurt within hours of each other in the same engagement. 1 American, 1 Japanese. What happened to them afterwards is the cleanest single comparison in the entire Pacific War, because every other variable is held constant. Same battle, same day, same class of damage. The American ship was USS Yorktown. A bomb penetrated her flight deck and detonated deep inside, killing dozens and wrecking compartments through several levels. She was down but steaming. The Japanese ship was Shokaku. She took bomb hits forward that tore up her flight deck and set fires, and left her unable to launch aircraft. Shokaku turned for home. Home was the Japanese naval yard at Kure, and the passage was thousands of miles. She was under repair for roughly 3 months. When the Imperial Navy fought the decisive battle of the war at Midway on the 4th of June, Shokaku was in a shipyard in Japan. Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor on 27 May. The dockyard estimate for her repair was 3 months, the same order of magnitude as Shokaku's. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Roughly 1,400 yard workers went aboard and stayed aboard, working in shifts around the clock, welding, shoring, patching, cutting away wreckage. They did not restore the ship. They made her able to fight. Yorktown sailed on 30 May, 3 days after she arrived, and on 4 June, her aircraft helped sink 2 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway before she was hit again. 2 ships, damaged in the same battle. One missed the decisive engagement of the Pacific War. The other fought in it and helped win it. Nothing about that outcome was determined by the carriers. It was determined by what was waiting for them when they were hurt. And in May 1942, the Americans were doing this at Pearl Harbor, a real base, with real dry docks, 4,000 miles behind the fighting. What the Japanese had not yet grasped was that the Americans intended to bring the dry docks forward. Section 2. The fleet that carried its own harbor, January 1944. Majuro Atoll, the Marshall Islands. The lagoon had been in American hands for days. Into it came a collection of ships that carried no significant offensive armament and appeared on no list of combatants. Repair ships, destroyer tenders, submarine tenders, oilers, ammunition ships, salvage vessels, floating machine shops, hospital ships, tugs. This was Service Squadron 10, commanded by Commodore Worrell Reed Carter, and it was the answer to a problem that had constrained every navy in history. Warships have always been tied to bases. A fleet can steam only as far as its dockyard permits, and when it takes damage, it must go back. Distance from the yard is a leash. In the Pacific, the leash was brutal. From the Marshalls to Pearl Harbor is over 2,000 miles, and from Pearl to the American West Coast is another 2,000. A damaged ship sent home could be gone for months, most of them spent simply traveling. Service Squadron 10 cut the leash by making the base mobile. Not a base the fleet returned to, a base that followed the fleet. It moved forward as the war moved. Majuro, then Eniwetok, then Ulithi. Each time the fighting advanced, the floating harbor picked itself up and advanced with it, and the distance from the front line to a full repair capability stayed short. Ulithi is the one that beggars belief. An atoll in the Western Carolines, occupied without opposition in September 1944, unknown to the American public because censorship kept it out of the newspapers entirely. Within months, it was the largest naval base in the world. On a single day in March 1945, there were more than 600 ships anchored in that lagoon. There was no city there. There were no permanent docks, no cranes on shore, no dry docks cut into rock. Every capability in that anchorage had been towed or sailed to a coral ring in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and moored. A fleet operating out of Ulithi was fighting off the Japanese home islands with a full repair yard 800 miles behind it, instead of 5,000. Section 3. Lifting a battleship. In the middle of the ocean. The hardest problem in ship repair is the part below the waterline. Torpedo damage, mine damage, grounding damage, a bent screw or a warped shaft, none of it can be reached with the ship afloat. It requires a dry dock, a structure that takes a warship out of the water entirely. Dry docks are civil engineering. They are excavated, poured in concrete, and fixed permanently to a coastline. Building one takes years, so the United States built dry docks that floated, in sections, and towed them across the Pacific. They were called Advanced Base Sectional Docks. Each one was assembled from a series of enormous steel sections, joined together in the water to form a single dock hundreds of feet long. The principle was the same as any floating dock. Flood the structure until it sinks beneath the ship, then pump the water out and let it rise, carrying the warship up out of the sea. What was new was the scale, and the fact that the whole thing could be broken into pieces, towed thousands of miles across open ocean, and reassembled at a captured anchorage. The largest of them could dock a battleship. Consider what that means. A capital ship takes a torpedo in the Western Pacific. Instead of a voyage of 5,000 miles and a repair measured in seasons, she steams a short distance to a lagoon, is lifted bodily out of the water inside a steel box that was itself towed there, has her hull plating cut away and replaced, and rejoins the fleet, while the ocean she is being repaired in remains a war zone. Alongside the docks work the repair ships themselves, vessels like Vestal, Ajax, Hector, and Jason, and the destroyer and submarine tenders. These were factories with bows. They carried foundries, forges, machine shops, pattern shops, electrical shops, optical shops, carpenters, welders, and metalsmiths, and they could fabricate a part that did not exist, rather than wait for one to be shipped from California. USS Vestal is the emblem of the whole idea. On 7 December 1941, she was moored alongside USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. She was hit and burning, and her crew ran her aground to save her. She was patched up, and she spent the rest of the war in forward anchorages, putting other ships back into the fight. The ship that survived Pearl Harbor spent 3 years undoing Japan's work. Section 4. What the Other Side had 17 February 1944. Truk Lagoon, the Caroline Islands. Truk was Japan's answer to all of this, and on paper, it was a good one. A vast natural anchorage in the Central Pacific, fortified, with fuel, workshops, and a floating dock. It was the forward base from which the combined fleet operated, and Allied planners spoke of it with real respect. Over 2 days, American carrier aircraft and surface ships tore it apart. Merchant tonnage, warships, aircraft, and shore installations were destroyed wholesale. Truk was not captured. It was bypassed and left to rot, its garrison intact and irrelevant for the rest of the war. With Truk gone, the Imperial Japanese Navy's repair situation reverted to the oldest arrangement in naval history. A damaged Japanese warship went home. Home meant the naval yards of the home islands, Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, and from the southern operating areas, that was a voyage of thousands of miles. It meant weeks of steaming at reduced speed, in a hull that was already compromised, through waters that by 1944 were the most dangerous in the world, because the Americans had submarines there. A crippled Japanese warship limping north at 15 knots, unable to maneuver hard, was close to an ideal target, and a significant number of damaged Japanese ships never reached the yards at all. Japan lost warships twice over, once to the damage, and again on the road to the repair that was supposed to undo it. The arithmetic compounded relentlessly. Japan had begun the war with fewer yards, less steel and fewer skilled shipwrights than the United States, and every one of those yards was being asked to build new ships, repair damaged ones, and by 1945 survive bombing. Damaged vessels queued. Some were never repaired at all because the material was needed elsewhere or the ship was judged not worth the steel. So the same event, a torpedo hitting a cruiser, produced two completely different consequences depending on the flag. For the Americans, it meant a few weeks at an anchorage that had not existed the year before. For the Japanese, it meant a ship removed from the war, possibly forever, and a dangerous voyage undertaken just to find out. Section 5. The Fleet That Would Not Stay Sunk, October 1944. Off Formosa, and then the Philippine Sea. Now return to the cold open and follow what the Japanese did with their false victory, because this is where repair ships stopped being a logistical detail and became a strategic weapon. The Formosa air battles cost Japan something in the order of 500 aircraft in a few days. And worse, they were the aircraft and crews earmarked for the defense of the Philippines. In exchange, Japanese aircrew reported 11 American carriers sunk. The two cruisers that really had been hit, Canberra and Houston, were both torpedoed and both saved. Houston took 2 torpedoes across separate days and flooded with thousands of tons of water, and she was neither scuttled nor abandoned. She was taken under tow and dragged more than 1,000 miles to Ulithi, where the floating base went to work on her. The American commander, with a certain black humor, grouped the two cripples together and used them as bait to try to draw Japanese surface forces into a trap. Meanwhile, the false sinking reports had gone up the chain, and the combined fleet's staff began planning the defense of the Philippines on the basis of an American carrier force that had been gutted. It had not been gutted. It had not lost a single ship. When the Japanese fleet sortied for Leyte Gulf later that month, it was executing a plan built on an intelligence picture that was not merely wrong, but inverted. Japanese officers went into the largest naval battle in history expecting to face the remnants of a broken enemy, and met a fleet at full strength. This was the recurring nightmare, and Formosa was only its most extreme expression. Through 1944 and 1945, Japanese pilots repeatedly attacked American ships, saw them burning, reported them destroyed, and then encountered the same hull numbers weeks later. Carriers hit by kamikazes, cruisers gutted by torpedoes, destroyers blown nearly in half, patched at an atoll and returned to the line. For a staff officer trying to estimate enemy strength, this is corrosive in a way that goes beyond any single battle. Intelligence works by subtraction. You count what the enemy had, subtract what you have destroyed, and plan against the remainder. When the subtraction stops working, when ships you removed from the ledger keep reappearing on it, you lose the ability to plan at all. Japanese naval officers came to fear American repair capability precisely because it made their own successes meaningless. A carrier could be fought and hit and hurt. It could not, apparently, be subtracted. Section 6. The Verdict. After the surrender, American teams interrogated the surviving officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy in detail and asked them to explain the defeat. The answers that came back were not primarily about individual battles. Japanese officers spoke about fuel, about aircrew training that collapsed as their veterans died, about submarines strangling the merchant fleet, and about an American fleet whose endurance they could not match or explain. A force that stayed at sea for months, that struck, withdrew a short distance, and returned at full strength, without ever going home. There was no mystery to it on the American side. It was Service Squadron 10. It was oilers refueling task forces underway, so the fleet never had to break off to reach a port. It was ammunition ships rearming carriers at sea. It was a floating dry dock towed 4,000 miles to an anchorage the Japanese had not thought worth defending, so that a battleship could be lifted out of the ocean and welded whole again 800 miles from Japan. Commodore Carter, who ran it, later wrote the definitive account of the effort. He titled it after the three things a fleet actually consumes: beans, bullets, and black oil. It is the least romantic title in the literature of the Pacific War, and it describes the mechanism that won it. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood the theory. It had studied logistics, and its officers were not fools. What it did not have was the industrial surplus to build an entire second fleet of ships, whose only purpose was to keep the first fleet fighting. Hundreds of vessels that would never sink an enemy, never appear in a communiqué, and never be credited with a victory. The United States built that second fleet, and it was the multiplier that made the first one unbeatable, which is the answer to the question in the title. A Japanese naval officer feared American carriers because they could destroy his ships. He learned to fear the repair ships because they meant that destroying theirs achieved nothing. You can win an engagement against a fleet. You cannot win a war against a fleet that repairs itself faster than you can damage it. The floating harbor vanished almost as completely as if it had been sunk. Ulithi emptied within months of the surrender. The 600 ships dispersed. The repair vessels sailed for home. The floating dry docks were towed away, sold, scrapped, or handed to other navies. The lagoon that had been the largest naval base on Earth went back to being a quiet atoll in the Western Carolines, home to a few hundred people, and the Americans who had passed through it were forbidden to describe it while it existed and had little reason to afterwards. Almost nothing marks it. There is no memorial at Ulithi remotely proportionate to what was assembled there. The repair ships had longer lives than most of the warships they served. Built to no glamorous purpose, they were too useful to discard. Several of the tenders and repair vessels of that war served on for decades, into the era of guided missiles and nuclear power, still carrying the same machine shops and doing the same work in the same unhurried way. And the doctrine outlived everything. Every American naval deployment since has rested on the same principle worked out in those lagoons, that reach is not a function of how far a warship can steam, but of how far from home it can be repaired. The Japanese officers who watched their victories evaporate understood it before most people on the winning side did. They had sunk the American fleet, repeatedly, in good faith, and reported it honestly. The fleet simply kept coming back.